He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Why would we be contemplating interest rates rising when everything is getting harder? Do new build houses lose value when they're not brand new anymore? And do you have to be living together to be captured by relationship property laws? We're getting into all of that and some more in this week's episode of No Stupid Questions. I'm Susan Edmonds, I'm RNZ's money correspondent, and I'm joined by Justin Gregory, asker of questions.
Asker of questions, consumer of goods, but less and less lately. How about you?
I think that's true of everyone lately, from what I can see. Let's get into it.
All right, our first question is from Richard. He has a question about the current state of the world.
Don't we all?
All right, this better be a big question. Here, just one question? Crikey, so many I've got. Anyway, but Richard, he says he has a degree in economics. Well, that's one up on me. But despite that, he's having serious difficulty understanding why interest rates are increasing. He says the central banks use higher rates to slow inflation caused by an overheating economy. Increasing interest rates generally slows economic activity. But the inflation we're bracing for at the moment, says Richard, isn't caused by an overactive economy. It's caused by an increase in fuel prices because of the war the USA started, says Richard, which we have no control over. Why would we choose, says Richard, to harm our economy further by doing further damage to ourselves?
Yes, this is a very pertinent question. We're suffering enough with the rising prices. Do we really want to get hit with higher mortgage costs too? I talked to BNZ Chief Economist Mike Jones about this.
It's a common question at the moment. And I think the first point is that it's not the Reserve Bank that's lifting interest rates. Right around the world, we've seen big increases in wholesale rates in response to what's going on in Iran, and that's prompted a smattering of lifts in retail rates. So there is speculation that authorities around the world might either lift interest rates earlier or, in some cases, cancel plans to cut rates, and that's what's pushing rates up. So in terms of whether or not those authorities follow through on that, I mean, that's very much an open and live debate. The Reserve Bank here is tasked, of course, with keeping inflation low and stable in that 1 to 3% band. We pretty much know inflation's going to shoot up above that. And as was pointed out in the question, that's inflation not caused by an overheating economy, but by a war overseas that we have nothing to do with. So it's a supply shock. In many ways, that's the worst kind. It boosts inflation, but it also puts the squeeze on incomes and growth. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of what you do with interest rates, we actually had quite a helpful sort of blueprint or one-on-one on this last week from the Reserve Bank's central bank governor. And the kind of the key points there were, first of all, the bank won't kind of react in a knee-jerk way and lift interest rates just because inflation is spiking up. It could be a temporary shock. It also puts the squeeze on growth, which might actually lower inflation. So the central bank parlance for that is to look through it, which is kind of code for do nothing, watch and wait initially. What they are on the lookout for, potentially with that interest rate stick at the ready, is any signs that the short-term inflation spike leads to a more enduring breakout of inflation. So this is what they call second-round effects, which is basically the idea that inflation kind of fans out through the economy, and you've got firms and consumers start to expect higher inflation and raise their prices or wages in anticipation for that. That's the sort of stuff that keeps central banks up at night. And they would need to counteract that with higher interest rates if it transpired. And then there's also the sort of third, lower probability scenario in which this shock ends up doing so much damage to the New Zealand economy that they could even lower interest rates. So still at the stage where we've got a sort of bunch of scenarios, and I think it's just in the nervous watch and wait sort of phase at the moment.
Yeah, it would be pretty hard on households, for example, wouldn't it? If interest rates were going up and fuel prices were going up and we were all, and potentially paying higher prices everywhere else. That would be a very awful scenario to be in.
Exactly. Cost of essentials, we know, is rising really rapidly, and then you put a increase in mortgage rates on top of that. You're really amplifying that pressure on households, and this is why supply shocks are really difficult for central banks to deal with, and they don't always deal with it perfectly. We sort of saw various examples around the world through, for example, the COVID period, because you can potentially amplify the headwinds already facing growth, which might actually end up taking care of inflation for you. So that's why I think it is important. We got that reiteration that the bank won't respond in a knee-jerk sort of way, but just going to wait and see, for example, and try and assess what those more medium-term implications for inflation are. The issue there, of course, is it's quite hard to disentangle them all when you've got a bunch of stuff happening all at once.
It's also worth pointing out that we're seeing some other countries putting up interest rates because their central banks responded differently to the last global shock. Way too many unprecedented times lately. Shamabil Yaqub has some good points on that.
So in Australia, they didn't raise interest rates as much as we did after COVID. And the idea was they wanted to protect the economy. And they did. They didn't have the downturn that we did. But they also had inflation that became quite problematic and became embedded. So now they're raising interest rates in the middle of a crisis, which is the worst possible thing you can do. So when there is an external shock, you shouldn't be responding with monetary policy. You should be looking through.
Okay, Martine wants to know, do new build houses experience the same rate of capital growth when house prices are rising, or do they have a bit of depreciation when they lose their newness? You know, I've asked this question of a real estate agent before in the past. He had no idea. It's a little further down the track now. I wonder what the answer is.
I've never owned one, but it must be quite cool to be the first person to live in a new house, apart from being scared that the dog is going to mark the floor or whatever.
First night's a tragedy. Everyone after that is just,
Oh, yeah.
Tuesday.
Once it happens, it's like, oh, well. Luckily for us, Nick Goodall at Cotality has actually looked into this, so I asked him to explain.
And the key thing that we looked at was to say, at a point in time, let's take all new builds and all existing properties, which was 2008, track them going forward. And, the short insight really was that, there's not too much difference. There are times where new builds do better. There's times where existing properties do better. But, there doesn't really seem to be that effect where as soon as you buy a new build, it depreciates in value. There's definitely some differences over time, but long term, they perform very similarly.
Okay, so it's not like a car.
Exactly. There's no driving off the lot car factor for a new build in housing like there is in cars.
Okay. And like for like, would you expect a new build to be more expensive to buy?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the fact that you generally got to, you're getting the land, the new build, everything that comes with it. But, part of that expectation is that you'll have lower maintenance costs over time as well. And obviously you've got a nicer place to live in if it's been recently built compared to that existing. So, more expensive, but, in many cases might be justifiable for many buyers.
All right, now we have a double question. 3 people pondering coming back to New Zealand and wondering what it means for their, you guessed it, pension or superannuation. In one case, Andrew says he's lived in the US since he was 17, but wonders whether he'd get a pension if he came back to New Zealand, given the volatile political climate. He's in his 50s. In another, Irene says she's a US citizen, but she's lived and worked in New Zealand for 13 years now. She contributed to Social Security while she was in the US, but says it won't be much when she gets to retirement. She wants to know whether she can get New Zealand super. So that's 2 out of 3. Susan, go.
Well, when you're moving to New Zealand from another country, whether your pension entitlement from that country offsets what you get in New Zealand super depends on what sort of system it is in the country that you've come from. So if our government thinks that what you're getting is similar to NZ super, then usually your entitlement from overseas reduces, usually dollar for dollar, what you can get from NZ super. But usually schemes that are voluntary aren't included because they're looked on as being a bit like KiwiSaver. But the US Social Security pension scheme is one that offsets New Zealand super, and I know there's been quite a bit of debate in the past about whether that's fair.
All right, and the third similar question, Prue says she's worked in the UK and has money in a UK pension scheme. If she transfers the money back to New Zealand, asks Prue, will she pay tax on it?
There is an exemption period for people moving to New Zealand where they can move their money tax-free if they do it within 4 years of becoming a New Zealand tax resident. And after that, there could be tax involved. I see that from April 1 this year, someone transferring a pension fund to some New Zealand schemes can have the scheme pay the tax that they are due to pay on their behalf. But there are lots of advisors who specialise in this, and I would really encourage her to get in touch because I don't think I should be giving advice on this one.
All right, now a question from Susan. Not this one, a different one.
Not me.
Not you. And she asks, I've been in a living apart together relationship with my partner of 6 years, meaning we are considered partners, but we don't live together, and we have completely separate finances. We spend about a night or two together a week, normally at my place, but sometimes at his. I understand these sorts of relationships are becoming more common, particularly for those of us that have been through a divorce. From a net worth perspective, says Susan, I'm worth more than my partner. From a Relationship Property Act, we're well over the 3-year threshold, says Susan again. However, given our separate finances and living arrangements, could Susan be at risk if she did break up with her partner? Susan, not that Susan, but this Susan, what do you got?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this before, what makes a relationship for legal purposes. The first thing to note is that you don't have to actually be living together to have the time that you're together count for relationship property purposes. I went to talk to Public Trust about this. They say what defines a couple being in a de facto relationship by law is determined by a range of things. It's not just about whether you live together or share finances. In deciding, the court will look at the overall nature of the relationship, they say. So that can include things like how long it was, whether you lived together and for how long, whether there was a sexual relationship, how financially connected you are, and then you look at things like whether people are relying on each other for money, whether they share finances, whether there are any arrangements to support each other financially, and they also look at whether you own property together, that sort of thing. There's also social stuff that's involved. They look at whether you're actively building a life together, whether you support children together, how you share your household tasks, and even what other people think of your relationship. And they say they recommend you get legal advice from a specialist property relationship lawyer, probably now, and you could consider a contracting out agreement if you don't want to be captured by the Property Relationships Act. And you probably also need to think about how your wills work in with that. We've had a few questions along those lines lately, and getting your wills sorted seems like a good idea.
That's a remarkably modern, progressive take from the Public Trust on what a relationship is. Well done. Mm-hmm. You want to be careful which friends you ask to describe your relationship, though, wouldn't you?
I did think that, actually.
Paul wants to know, is the government receiving more tax revenue as a result of this increase in fuel costs, and if so, why? We are all struggling with this, says Paul.
Yeah, I think this is debatable, and I've seen both sides argued recently. There will be more GST being paid if people are paying more for their petrol, but it's also possible that they're cutting down on other spending elsewhere because people usually have a finite amount of money that they're spending. So if the fuel takes more of it, you probably have less going elsewhere. So I understand why people might be worried that the government's cashing in on GST, but overall, I don't think that this is going to be any sort of windfall for them.
All right, Susan, this week you wrote about something that might be a worry for lots of parents. Kids accidentally spending money on their parents' credit cards. What happened there, and is there a personal story involved?
This is something that has definitely happened in my own household, but this story was fortunately not my own. Financial Services Complaints, which deals with complaints about some financial providers. There are 3 dispute schemes, so it's a bit confusing. But it reported on a case that it had dealt with where a 6-year-old managed to spend $800 buying gems for his video game.
There's a lot of things I could say in response to that, but I'll just confine myself to asking, how did he do this?
Well, apparently his father had loaded his credit card details onto his computer, which his son also used. So his son maybe didn't even realise what was happening, and he was buying all the gems he wanted in the game. And then in the end, the dad ended up with such a lot on his credit card that he couldn't buy food, which is a bit grim.
So what's the message for parents here, Susan?
I think it's a warning to be really careful about where you store your credit card details, and it seems that everywhere wants them stored now, and that is very convenient in lots of ways, but it does also mean that it's very easy for other people to access your information. My husband was on school camp last week, and he sent me a message at one point going, "What's Liam been putting on my credit card?" And it was something from Roblox, so oops, sorry about that. So a PIN number or a password or something can protect it. And it's also very important if you want your card provider to reimburse you for any losses. Because if you have your cards stored on your phone, for example, then you lose your phone and you don't have a PIN number, you might not have any recourse there.
In the last episode, we asked when New Zealand's last attempt at a major superannuation savings scheme was, and the answer is...
Last December was 50 years since then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon cancelled the super scheme we might have had. Something about dancing Cossacks? So the answer is the mid-1970s.
Now, we want to know how much have... Roblox again. Now, we want to know how much have Roblox share prices risen since they listed. I don't know anything about Roblox, but my 6-year-old daughter does. So, Susan, what?
You will soon know more. I did actually get the kids to put some money into Roblox via Sharesies and tried to sell it to them as an alternative, but they persist in wanting to buy the Robux in the game.
Okay, send your answers to questions@rnz.co.nz.
As well as any other money thoughts or queries you might have. We want them all. No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmonds was written and presented by Susan Edmonds, that's me. Justin Gregory is the producer. The engineer is Phil Bench. Thanks to Richard, Martine, Andrew, Irene, Prue, Susan, not me, and Paul for their questions, and Mike Jones, John Berry, Shamabil Yakub, Nick Goodall, and the Public Trust for their answers. Follow and listen to No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmonds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Stay safe, everyone.